In the last video, I addressed the claim that the Septuagint translation of the Book of Psalms, or at least of Psalm 22:17, was made by a Christian. I explained how the evidence points to something very different, namely, that this translation predates Christianity and is therefore most plausibly regarded as Jewish in origin. In this video, we'll talk a bit more about the Septuagint, but then also talk about some additional external support beyond the Septuagint for this reading of "they dug my hands and feet." So starting out, let me read again this verse according to the Septuagint translation. "For many dogs encircled me. An assembly of evildoers surrounded me. They dug my hands and feet." In agreement with the Masoretic text, the Greek translator appears to have identified 3 kola in this verse, and I trust that you'll remember what a colon is from the first video in this series. Unlike the Masoretic text, however, the translator did not read ka'ari, like a lion in his Hebrew forlaga, but a third-person plural verb, karu, spelled either with or without an aleph in the second position. We'll see in a moment that both of these readings turn up in extant Hebrew manuscripts. If the Septuagint translator read kaf resh vav, he obviously derived the verb from the third weak root kara, to dig, just as he did in Psalm 57, verse 7. But what if he read kaf aleph resh vav? It's often alleged that there was no kaf aleph resh root in ancient Hebrew. I think this is probably correct, although there are some who would argue otherwise. As I mentioned in my article, some have conjectured the existence of a hollow root, kaf aleph resh, with the meaning of bind, and others have proposed that the Aramaic root, kaf aleph resh, which means to soil, make repugnant, was brought over into Hebrew as a loan word. But I argue that these conjectures are unlikely, and in any case, they wouldn't explain the Septuagint, at least if we assume that the Septuagint translator was using a forlaga that had kaf aleph resh vav and not simply kaf resh vav. The Septuagint translator obviously understood the aleph as a mater lectionis and derived the verb from the third weak root kara, kaf resh he, which again means to dig. Okay, so let me explain what I'm talking about here. A mater lectionis is basically a consonant that functions as a vowel. If you know anything about Hebrew, you know that originally Hebrew didn't have any vowels. It was all consonants, so it's a bit like this sentence here. Now, if you saw this written somewhere, you'd probably stare at it for a moment, but then you'd figure out what it says. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. And you can figure that out because you're fluent in English and because you've probably come across this sentence before. And so you can intuit pretty easily what the vowels are supposed to be. But if that's the way that we wrote English, you can imagine that there would be a lot of situations where the author's intended meaning would not be so obvious. For example, imagine if you saw this word here, CT. That could be read as cat. Or it could be read as cot, like the thing that you sleep on. Or it could be read as a verb, act. Or maybe it's not the verb act, but the noun act. Or maybe it's the word coat. Or maybe it's the word city. There are lots of different options here. And so in Hebrew, because of the ambiguities that would inevitably arise when the vowels were not being indicated, later scribes would often insert vowels. Now, they weren't vowels at first, but consonants. But these consonants could function as vowels. And so, for example, they would insert a vav in order to indicate that an O vowel or a U vowel was to be pronounced. They would insert a yod in order to indicate that an I vowel was to be pronounced. And they would insert an aleph to indicate that an A vowel was to be pronounced. So these are called matras lectionis, or the singular mater lectionis. It translates as mother of the reading. So it's kind of a metaphor, right? Imagine your mom sort of standing over your shoulder as you're learning to read and coaching you along the way. That's what these extra letters do. They guide you on how to pronounce your Hebrew. Now, this is different from what the later Masoretic scribes would do when they would insert little dots and lines below, above, and even inside the consonants in order to indicate vowels and other pronunciation issues. So these matris lectionis were not original to the Hebrew. I don't know when the convention was introduced, but even after it wasn't adopted universally or even consistently by each scribe. So sometimes you'd see them and other times you wouldn't, even within the same manuscript. I suspect that they were often inserted when a scribe thought that there could be some ambiguity in a text. And so perhaps that's why it turned up here in Psalm 22:17. Because if a scribe read this word as karu, then there's some ambiguity because this is actually a third he verb, even though the he drops out for reasons that I won't go into, but which you should already understand if you know anything about Hebrew. If you do know anything about Hebrew, you know that third he verbs are often ambiguous, since they can be misidentified as other weak verbs, such as hollow, or perhaps certain forms of first nun verbs. Kaf resh vav might have been ambiguous as well if its meaning within the context of Psalm 22 didn't seem particularly obvious. In a later video, I'll provide some philological evidence for thinking that the root kara, kaf resh he, could actually convey the idea of pierce or perforate. But if that's not the case, and the verb here can only really be taken to mean dig, we would have to understand the psalmist as invoking some sort of metaphor. Either way, some later copyist may have worried that readers would not recognize how the word was supposed to be pronounced and interpreted. He therefore added an aleph to ensure that the verb would be handled properly. Or it could just be that some scribe really liked these matris lectionis. He didn't really need a reason beyond just that. Okay, so all that to say that kaf aleph resh vav would not have been unintelligible, as some folks on the internet have suggested. If the psalmist originally wrote, "they dug," he probably wrote it without the aleph, but then a later scribe inserted the aleph in order to help the reader understand how to pronounce the verb and, in effect, interpret the text. Now, if the Septuagint was the only witness to this reading of "they dug," we could perhaps dismiss it as an anomaly. But the reading turns up in other witnesses too, in other translations, and in at least some surviving Hebrew manuscripts. So this suggests that the Septuagint rendering was not some kind of anomaly, but attests to a broader manuscript tradition, or at least a manuscript reading, that existed from before the emergence of Christianity. Let's look at some of the evidence for this. Tertullian, who was writing at the beginning of the 3rd century AD, and Jerome, in his Latin Vulgate, both read foderant, they dug. Now, Tertullian was definitely following the Septuagint here, since he didn't know any Hebrew. Jerome had, of course, studied Hebrew, but his Latin translation here was based on the Septuagint, not the Hebrew. Later on, he would produce a translation from the Hebrew, known as the Juxta Hebraicum, and in that translation, he would render our disputed word with winxerunt, they bound. I don't put much stock in this translation, however. I suspect that he was simply following the lead of Aquila and Symmachus here. We'll talk more about Aquila's translation later. The Syriac translation, known as the Peshitta, also reads a verb here, and it can perhaps be rendered into English as, they penetrated my hands and feet. Now, the Peshitta, as a translation of the whole Old Testament, is interesting because it appears to have been a direct translation of the Hebrew, or at least of the Aramaic. On the other hand, at some points it shows signs of influence from the Septuagint. So for that reason, the value of the Syriac for retroscribing the Hebrew of Psalm 22:17 is a matter of dispute. In support of its value, though, the influence of the Septuagint here is difficult to detect. Note, for example, that the verb that it uses in the third colon is not a translational equivalent of the Greek verb oryxon. Also, it doesn't use the word many, as we find in the Septuagint. With these observations in view, note this comment by Michael P. Weitzman. He's commenting here on how we might ascertain whether the Peshitta at any given point has been influenced by the Septuagint or whether its translator was relying entirely on the Hebrew. Note, by the way, that he's speaking here about the book of Psalms specifically. He says, the less specific the agreement that the Peshitta has with the Septuagint, the less confident we can be that the Septuagint influenced the Peshitta. I think Weitzman's comment here is germane to the verse that we've been looking at in Psalm 22. The agreement between the Peshitta and the Septuagint is quite minimal, and is really nothing more than we would expect if the translator had not been using the Septuagint at all. Aside from the Septuagint and the Syriac, the best support for "they dug" really comes from Hebrew manuscripts. In Kennicott's Vetus Testamentum Hebraicum, 13 manuscripts are cited with the reading of "karu," 5 that are spelled kaf resh vav, and 6, or probably 8, that are spelled kaf aleph resh vav. Okay, so the surviving Hebrew manuscripts from the medieval period provide some early and significant support for the same Hebrew reading that was used by the Septuagint translator. But even more significantly, this reading is now attested in one of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments from the Nahal Hever region, which the editors have assigned to a late Herodian date of about 50 to 68 AD. Now, many have pointed out that vavs and yods were often written in a way that they looked very similar to one another, and because of that, they were often confused. So it's often been argued that the Septuagint translator simply misread his Hebrew manuscript, mistaking the final yod for a vav. But while this may account for confusion in other texts, it seems unlikely that this is what the Septuagint translator did when he translated "they dug" in Psalm 22:17, or that this is what the other scribes did when they copied those medieval manuscripts that are mentioned by Kennicott. You'll notice that in the examples I just showed, the yods extend down further than we would expect. That's why it's so easy for non-native Hebrew speakers to confuse them with vavs. The opposite isn't true, though. Vavs are never written to look like yods. So if the letter in question doesn't extend down to the bottom, we always know that it's a yod and not a vav. And if the scribe doesn't write his yods like vavs, then there's no reason to assume that when a character looks like a vav, it could just as well be read as a yod, or vice versa. So with these observations in view, let's look at the manuscript from Nahal Hever and see what sort of handwriting we're dealing with. It's quite clear that, at least in this manuscript, the scribe did not write his yods like the scribes did in those other manuscripts. His yods are noticeably shorter than his vavs. Look here at the verb hikifuni. Here's a yod, here's a final yod, and here's a vav. I'm making a special point here to note that this is a final yod because I've heard someone trying to argue that the final letter on karu is actually a yod. It just extends further down than usual because it's a final yod. Look though, this is a final yod, and it's clearly not as long as the final letter on karu. Here's another example. Look at this phrase. Yabitu yiru vi. They gawked. They looked upon me. Here's a yod, and here's a vav. The scribe clearly differentiated between the two letters. And then with yiru vi, here's a yod, a vav, and a final yod, which looks just like this yod. And here, I think, is a really illustrative example. This is verse 16. Malkochai, my jaws, followed by vela'afar mawet, and to the dust of death. Notice first the vav in malkochai, and the final yod on the same word, which is then followed by a vav. The final yod doesn't come down as far as the vav. So it's methodologically flawed, I think, to compare this manuscript with others where the yods are often indistinguishable from vavs. We need to bear in mind that scribes often had different writing styles, so what might be true of one manuscript might not be true of another. At least in this manuscript from Nahal Hever, the scribe wrote his yods and vavs in ways that allowed the reader to distinguish between them. Now, we don't know whether the Septuagint translator read Kaf Resh Vav or Kaf Aleph Resh Vav. If he read Kaf Resh Vav, the final letter must have been a Vav, because a Yod wouldn't have made any sense. And the same can be said of the 5 manuscripts in Kennicott that read Kaf Resh Vav. The final letter must have been a Vav. It couldn't have been a Yod, so that needs to be explained. But what about the longer spelling, Kaf Aleph Resh Vav? Well, here's something that Kip Davis alleges.
It's probably a Vav, which would, and that actually doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Kaf Aleph Resh Vav is not a word. It's not, which is why we tend to think this is a scribal error. This is a mistake that a scribe has made.
It seems likely that the Septuagint translator encountered a reading like this one in the Nahal Hever Psalm scroll, or he encountered a reading in a scroll in which the letters Vav and Yod were indistinguishable. He was, as a result, confused by what he saw and rendered it with horaksan, thinking that maybe this was a lengthened form of karu from the root kara, which means to dig.
Notice that Davis only speaks here about the Septuagint and the Nahal Hever scroll. This isn't the only evidence that we have for this reading. So we need to frame the issue more accurately here by asking, can the several examples of this reading in the Septuagint, the Nahal Hever manuscript, the Syriac Peshitta, the translations by Aquila, which we'll be looking at a bit later, and the 13 different readings in Kennicott all be dismissed as instances of copyists misreading a yod for a vav? I would have to answer that question in the negative, and here's why. First, that's a lot of ancient scribes and translators that we'd have to accuse of misreading their manuscripts. Second, the third colon of this verse desperately needs a verb in order to indicate what's being done to the psalmist's hands and feet. A vav at the end of this word would therefore provide a crucial syntactical element to this verse. That's because the vav makes the word into a third plural verb, which is precisely what we would expect in this context, where the psalmist is talking about his enemies in the third person. It's often alleged, especially on YouTube and other online forums, that the final letter here can't possibly be a vav because Kaf Aleph Resh Vav would have been completely nonsensical. Any scribe or reader would have therefore immediately recognized that the final letter can only be read as a yod and not as a vav, even if it looked like a vav. But this isn't true. I've already explained that the aleph could have easily been read as a mater lectionis. In other words, it could have easily been construed as indicating a long A vowel. So Kaf Aleph Resh Vav would not have looked like a nonsensical word, and a reader or a scribe would not have immediately concluded that the last letter had to be a yod, even if it looked like a vav. Especially in this context, where a verb seems so badly needed. In fact, we have very clear evidence of at least 3 ancient translators who definitely read the last letter as a vav. I'm referring here to the translator of the Septuagint, Aquila, and the Syriac Peshitta. Here once again is the Septuagint. Unless one wants to argue that this translator's forlage read Kaf Resh Vav without the aleph, in which case, at least as far as we can determine, it could only have meant they dug my hands and my feet. Unless one wants to argue that, one will have to admit that this ancient translator read Kaf Aleph Resh Vav and interpreted it as a third plural verb from the root Kaf Resh He. Either way, he clearly read the last letter as a Vav, not a Yod. And there's no reason to assume that he did this because he was some kind of bumbling nincompoop who just didn't know what to make of this strange word that lay before him. No, this is a very natural way to read this text. The aleph, as I've explained, would have been quite naturally understood to be a mater lectionis. All right? And the claim that the Hebrew would have been most naturally understood as ka'ari, like a lion, is also contradicted by the two renderings of Aquila. Aquila was a Jew who lived in the 2nd century AD, flourishing around the year 130 or so. He was certainly not a Christian, much less a Christian apologist. He was actually a disciple of the famous Rabbi Akiva, and he was probably motivated in large measure to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek because Christians had been using the Septuagint to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. Initially, he rendered the text in Psalm 22:17 as Eis kunan keras mu kai podas, which we could translate into English as, they put to shame or disgraced my hands and feet. How exactly he arrived at this rendering is uncertain, although one biblical scholar from the beginning of the 20th century named Charles Taylor has offered what I think is a convincing proposal. He suggested that Aquila read the word as some form of the root nakar, nun kaf resh. He noted, for example, that the noun hakara, which is a derivative of the verb nakar, and occurs only once in the Hebrew Bible at Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9, where it's usually translated as something like countenance or appearance, is translated in the Septuagint with the word aiskune, shamefulness. Now, this rendering isn't something out of left field. The Hebrew root could apparently connote the idea of foreignness or unfamiliarity, hence profaneness. And so Taylor also notes that the same verbal root, when it's used in the hefil in Proverbs 28:21, is rendered by the Septuagint translator as hos uk aiskunatai prosapa dikaion uk agathos, which could be translated into English as, whoever does not feel ashamed before the face of the righteous is not good. Well, however Aquila came up with his translation here, it's clear that he did not understand the kaf as a preposition and the remaining letters as the word for lion. Interestingly, he would later change his translation to epereson, they bound. And he may have done this because he realized that his first translation could still be used by Christians as a proof text for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, a few commentators have suggested that he based this translation on an unknown Hebrew root that meant bind. But although this is possible, it's purely conjectural. And even if it were true, it wouldn't necessarily preclude someone from also understanding it to mean they dug, since karu could definitely mean that as well. It would be a bit like if the psalmist had written in English and said, I am feeling cross because of the sins of humanity. A Christian interpreter might take this as a double entendre, with the psalmist prophetically hinting at Christ suffering on the cross for the sins of humanity. A non-Christian, on the other hand, might respond with, Oh, silly Christians, there's no double entendre here. The psalmist is simply telling us that he's feeling annoyed, perhaps because someone sinned against him. Okay, but with that said, I have to add that I'm pretty skeptical about whether this word could in fact mean bind. I suspect that Aquila used the verb epereson for two reasons, neither of which was lexicographical. First, because it seemed to fit the context, where the psalmist's enemies are clearly doing something to his hands and feet. Second, because it deprived Christians of a favorite proof text for Jesus' crucifixion. But whatever his reason, whether lexicographical or apologetical, he clearly understood the final letter as a vav, because he interpreted it as a third-person plural verb, and that fact does not comport with the majority reading of ka'ari, like a lion. So if anyone tells you that kaf aleph resh vav would have been nonsensical in ancient Hebrew, or that the Hebrew text here could have only been read as kaf aleph resh yod, just send him a link to this video, because he clearly doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, and here's something else to think about. Notice that the word that we've been considering is immediately followed by a word that starts with a yod. Given this fact, any scribe who differentiated his yods from vavs would have had every reason to make sure that these two letters were written in ways that could allow the reader either to identify or distinguish them from one another. And as we just saw, at least in this manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were written in such a way as to be distinguished from one another. Notice that this letter comes down much further than this one. So there's no doubt that this is a yod, and this is not a yod, but a vav. All right, now let me say something a little more about the third variant that is attested in the manuscript tradition. I'm talking about kaf resh vav, karu. This derives from the same verbal root as kaf aleph resh vav, at least how I've been arguing that kaf aleph resh vav ought to be understood. Kaf resh vav is thought to be attested in another manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls called 4Q Psalm F, or 4Q 88, fragments 1 and 2, which the editors date to about 50 BC. Now, this reading has been disputed because the verb that we're looking at here, karu, supposedly, has not been preserved except in a few tiny ink spots. Despite the obvious difficulties in trying to reconstruct this badly damaged text, the editors have suggested that the manuscript read karu, kaf resh vav, perhaps in view of such things as the spacing between words and the small bits of letters that are still preserved in the manuscript. Now, if you look at the photographs, you might wonder to yourself how any determination could have been made about what this text had originally said.
The reading that we're talking about occurs at the very bottom. Here is the hey, the kof. Here's the vav, the pei. So this is the previous word. Peter Flint has actually read karu here somewhere.
Are you kidding me?
Which I'm not. He's suggesting this is what's on the bottom line of this fragment. So he's reading that from these letters here.
Well, look at those letters, by the way.
So
It's
right
just
on the bottom.
so
here.
hard to see that.
It's crazy. So, and I'm going to suggest that, yeah, it's nonsense that you can even clearly see the kof or the resh to say nothing of whether this is a vav or a yod.
It's sometimes easy to be skeptical about stuff like this when the only thing that we have access to is a two-dimensional image. We should bear in mind that the editors in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volumes were working with the original manuscripts. That's not to say that they couldn't make mistakes, or that their judgments can now no longer be questioned. However, I think that we can assume that the scholars who had access to these manuscripts were generally in a better position than we are for figuring out what they say. That's because they were able to manipulate the manuscripts, look at them from various angles, compare them with related fragments, examine them under magnification, and so on. So I would caution against any overly dismissive attitudes here. I mean, the Discoveries in the Judean Desert volumes were published by Oxford, and all of the entries were peer-reviewed. In defense of this reconstruction, I personally find it difficult to read the letter here as an aleph, since the alephs in this manuscript don't typically scoop up higher on the top left part of the diagonal stroke than the line that extends up on the right. So it seems more likely that the letter here is a resh. And if that's the case, then there's just no room for an aleph. And if there's no room for an aleph, then the word would have had to have ended with a vav. So there's no doubt about what the final letter would have been. We should also not forget that kaf resh vav is definitely attested in several medieval manuscripts. So even if it turns out that we can't say anything about the text in 4Q88, this doesn't preclude the possibility that kaf resh vav was a very ancient reading, perhaps even what the psalmist originally wrote. The Septuagint translator must have used a manuscript that either read kaf resh vav or kaf aleph resh vav. And we've seen that the same can be said about Aquila in his translations. And the same can probably also be said about the Syriac Peshitta. It's reasonable to suspect that the Karu reading was suppressed within the Masoretic text tradition. One well-known publisher from the 1500s stated that when he was preparing a rabbinic Bible for publication, his manuscript read Karu with a vav. But since he knew that no Jew would purchase his Bible if it had that letter in it, he altered it to a yod. I think it's a pretty safe bet to assume that this kind of textual manipulation of Hebrew manuscripts was not unparalleled, especially before the invention of the printing press, and especially in a text like Psalm 22:17, where the theological stakes seemed so high. Okay, so far we've seen that "they dug my hands and my feet" finds credible support from the Syriac and Greek translations, and from extant Hebrew manuscripts, both from the medieval period and at least one manuscript from as early as the 1st century AD. I think this constitutes some pretty compelling external support. But there's more. In an article from 1897, a commentator named Henry Lessett observed that although the church father Justin Martyr quotes Psalm 22 for his Jewish interlocutor Trypho, and although he appeals to it as a proof text for Christ's crucifixion, he never pauses to consider Jewish objections to the Septuagint's rendering of verse 17. And since Justin elsewhere shows an awareness and a sensitivity to Jewish objections about other Septuagint renderings, Lessett hypothesized that kaf aleph resh vav, or kaf resh vav, was still the established reading in the mid-2nd century, when Justin was writing. Another commentator named Gregory Vall has recently characterized this as an argument from silence. But this response, I think, is too glib. An argument from silence can have some validity if we have grounds to expect something more than just silence. Lessett's point was that since Justin elsewhere is not silent about Jewish objections to Septuagint renderings that are being used as proof texts by Christians, we wouldn't expect for him to be silent here. Rather, after citing Psalm 22:17, and then the entire 22nd chapter, as a proof for Jesus' crucifixion, we should expect for him to have tried addressing Jewish objections to this rendering, if indeed he knew of any. Moreover, it's not an argument from silence when there are several ancient sources from before or around the time of Justin that support the reading of "they dug," either in Hebrew manuscripts themselves, as in the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or indirectly through translations, as in the case of the Septuagint, the Peshitta, and Aquila's original translation, which arguably read kaf resh vav or kaf aleph resh vav. Okay, I think that's about all I'm going to be able to cover in this video. In the next one, I'll be looking at some of the internal evidence that corroborates the minority reading. And as part of that, I'll be delving into some pretty interesting hermeneutical issues, asking what exactly the psalmist may have meant if indeed he wrote, "They dug my hands and my feet." Thanks for listening.